evening, everybody. Welcome to an impromptu live stream of World History 2. Uh, we're going to do today, we're going to do a couple things. Number one, I wanted to cover the last lecture for Unit 1. We're going to be talking about the nation state. We're going to talk about the advent of sort of more modern systems of governance. And I also have a plus office hours here because instead of doing a lecture and then office hours live stream, I'm just going to do a live lecture with office hours either at the end or at the beginning. So what we're going to do is, we can do this one in two ways. Number one, we can do the office hours first. In which case, there's a chat box right here to the side of my face, so like somewhere over here. You could participate in that. I have an eye on the chat right here, so I can keep an eye on sort of what's going on and what you guys are saying. And you guys can ask me questions on the midterm, questions on the content, questions on anything. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and all that fun stuff. Or we could start with the lecture and then do the office hours at the end. I see there's a couple of you in here already. So I'm going to proceed with the lecture, but if you guys really would rather do the office hours first, just holler in the comment section and we can get to it. So let's wrap up Unit 1, shall we? What we're going to try to ask today is a simple question, really. Because we've kind of done a tour around the world. We started in the Americas, then we went to Europe, then we went to Africa, and went to Asia. And I'm kind of wrapping up this story back in Europe because something momentous is about to happen. In part because we left the story in Europe on something of a cliffhanger. Yeah, we kind of left it in a bit of an odd situation, is how we left Europe. We left Europe in the throes of the sort of massive crisis of religion war that culminates in the 30 Years' War, sort of large, big conflagration, lots of people dead. And we talked about attempts at solutions to the problem. We talked about the Treaty of Augsburg. But ultimately, those solutions at first didn't work. And so as we enter into the 1600s, after having gone through almost a century at this point of religious turmoil and violence, and that's kind of the contradiction of the era, right? Where you have this sort of massive level of chaos and violence juxtaposed with these countries also beginning a shift away from feudalism to mercantilism as a system of economic governance, and all of the side stuff that comported. But over the past couple classes, what I've been doing is kind of putting some seeds in here for what's about to happen in Europe. Because we are going to move away politically from the feudal model into something that much more closely resembles the politics of today. In fact, this new model, the nation state, I call the development of the nation state a three-legged stool. What do I mean by that? You basically need three changes to happen simultaneously. And if they don't all happen at the same time, or at least consecutively, the nation state doesn't happen. Right? You need these three sort of legs to the stool to prop up this change. And we've looked at all of these changes already. Each one of the classes that kind of touched upon Europe seeded a new idea. First and foremost, we talked about the demographic changes that are happening in Europe. We're talking about the development of cities for the first time, largely driven by the wealth, resources, and more importantly, high-calorie foods coming in from the Columbian Exchange. That is really driving the urbanization of Europe in and around this period of time. So, not for nothing, in a Western Civ class, we talk about this period as, the Renaissance. Right? The 1500s in Italy are the Renaissance. Florence and Milan, these cities become big cities right around this period of time. but they didn't become big cities on the power of vibes. They became big cities on the power of basic economics, essentially. As these high-calorie foods are arriving into Europe, sort of changing the math, changing the ratio for food surpluses, peasants were freed up to move into the cities to create the backbone of a new, increasingly urban labor force. Okay? So first things first, we see demographic changes that lead to urbanization. Step 2, we needed a political change in Europe. More importantly, that political change is the Protestant Reformation. Because yes, the Protestant Reformation is a lot about religion, and I don't want to negate that. But inherent in the Protestant Reformation was this idea that they were seeking political independence as well as religious independence. Remember, we talked about the political role of the Pope in Lecture 2. We talked about the sort of advent of the Dictatus Papae. We talked about all of these things. We talked about how the Pope is increasingly a political office rather than a religious one, and who has some sort of de facto control over all of the Catholic nations. By declaring themselves non-Catholic, a lot of these countries have declared political independence for the first time. And that allows them to sort of chart their own course. And that's important. Because I would argue that a country cannot truly be independent if the Pope still gets the final say through the power of things like excommunication, right? So take France, for example. A country like France is never really free to do what's in the interest of the French people, so long as the Pope has a de facto veto power over everything the French king does. Right? In practice, it's the Pope that's running the show, just with extra steps. And that's what was going on in Europe for around this period of time. The Protestant Reformation changes that math. And even for the Catholic countries, the Counter-Reformation, also, they're seeing the stepping back of the role of the Pope in at least political matters, allows the Catholic nations, too, to begin to chart their own course. We are starting to see a political shift in Europe, a change in the political dynamics in Europe. But last but not least, I would argue that mercantilism is incredibly important for the advent of the nation state. Why? So in our class on the transatlantic slave trade, we talked a lot about how the advent of mercantilism had a really profound impact on the transatlantic slave trade, right? And I don't want to sit here and say that that's not one of the biggest contributions to history that mercantilism did. However, there was a side effect, because one of the key tenets of mercantilism is that there is such a thing as the national interest, that there are certain things you can do with the economy that are good for the country. But the minute you say that, you're admitting that there's a national interest, right? You're basically saying, hey, there are things that are good for France as a concept that I should be doing as part of my mercantilist ideologies. Philip van Hornik is writing about mercantilism right around turn of the century, 1500s to 1600s. So that kind of tracks with what we're talking about here. And I think sort of larger term, as you see the urbanization happen in the first leg, you needed an urban economy to follow it. You needed a move away from feudalism. Mercantilism being a success on day one is one of the reasons why feudalism kind of fell out of fashion. It would remain, but as a country, the focus became cities, not fields anymore, right? This is not the Middle Ages anymore. Countries are kind of growing up. And so in order to understand the shift, let me ask you a question. What's the difference between a kingdom and a state that happens to be ruled by a king? Well, at first glance, these terms might seem identical. They might just seem, they mean the same thing. That's all well and good. But I promise you there's a difference. You see, in order to think about this, let's do the Mark Lane special. Let's go with a pop culture reference, shall we? Lion King. All right? Listen, millennials, Disney adults, insert your jokes here. At the start of The Lion King, yeah? You have Mufasa and Simba chilling on Pride Rock, and I'm sure nothing bad will happen to break up this wonderful family dynamic. But at the heart of that conversation, one of these early conversations in the movie between Mufasa, rest in peace, James Earl Jones, and Simba, is this conversation. Quote, "Everything the light touches is your kingdom." Simba. Is your kingdom. The kingdom belongs to you. Fundamentally, in a kingdom, you have to imagine that the entirety of the apparatus of the government exists to serve the whims and the interests of the monarch. And that makes sense because we looked at feudalism, right? You guys remember when we talked, I hope you guys remember anyway, when I talked about feudalism, I said, hey, it's a system of reciprocal relations and distributed land management. I am king, because God says so, and I split up my land into tranches, into slices, to give to people I trust and to my nobility, right? But that whole system existed to serve my interests. We saw that at the end because King Mark I ended with the most money in that analogy. But I think as a broader point, if the feudal model didn't exist to serve me, why would I do it? All right? Feudalism was always understood for feudal kingdoms that the whole concept of government existed to serve me, the king. But that's changing. That's shifting. Those ideas are kind of changing over time as we're starting to see. Because, think about it. If the focus of the government, the focus of the king isn't the fields, it's not feudalism anymore, it's mercantilism, well then the very conception of government has to change. And that's exactly what happens. We move from feudal kingdoms to states with kings. The difference in a state that is ruled by a king is that the state exists and that the king exists to serve it. You understand? It is not the government, the state, the country that exists to serve the interests of the king, but it is the king that exists to serve the interests of the country. And it is this shift that happens right around the final years of the 30 Years' War. And that kind of makes sense, right? Think about it from like the personal angle of even the individual soldiers fighting in this. We said that this 100 years of conflagration, religious violence, they're the bloodiest years in European history. It would take the invention of World War I. We would need to invent tanks and guns and all that fun stuff just to solve the problem, just to kill more people than died in the Protestant Reformation years. Now, I want you to imagine Joe Schmo fighting and dying for the whims of his king and starting to think to himself, wow, maybe the king does not have the national interest in mind. Maybe there's something else going on here that we have to figure out. And that's kind of what starts to happen. That's kind of what starts to emerge towards the end of the 30 Years' War, especially as the early solutions fail. I would remind you that we talked about this, the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Augsburg. This failed. The solution to the problem that emerges in the early years of the Protestant Reformation doesn't work. Cuius regio eius religio didn't work. We talked about this. We said that all this does, all that this created, was a world in which the conflict between Catholics and Protestants moved to one between countries, moved to one within countries. As kings and queens around Europe, lords around Europe, tried to enforce the unenforceable, to compel people to convert to their own religion to maintain this treaty. And it didn't work. All it did was lead to more violence, which is why, by the end of the conflict, we would need a new treaty. And thus, one of the most important dates and most important events you've probably never heard of unless you're a poli-sci nerd. Yeah, this guy. But seriously, it's one of the only dates I'm going to ask you guys to remember as part of this course. And that is 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. Because the Treaty of Westphalia fundamentally solves the underlying issue of the 30 Years' War. It solves the political crisis. Because the Treaty of Westphalia does three things. Number one, it establishes the state. It establishes national sovereignty. Now, what does that mean? Remember, when I talked about feudalism, I said that the entirety of the apparatus of the government exists to serve me the king, King Mark I. That I've created a country where none existed before, right? I created the country of Markovania, let's say, for Mark, not for Megan, right? For Markovania. That's my country, right? I created this country in a feudal model that exists to serve my interests. Over the years, the argument becomes this thing that I've created, Markovania, hypothetically, exists independently of me. It's an abstract concept. It exists in the minds of the people that inhabit this country. There's a nation. It is a nation, right? Whose borders are maybe clear, maybe not. Whose concepts are clear and maybe not. But fundamentally, there's an abstract, almost philosophical idea of what this country is. And so suddenly, the country doesn't serve me, I serve the country. And that's the change. We've invented the nation state. Here's an analogy. Think of America, institutions, right? You know, IRS, FBI, White House, Congress, institutions of America. That's the state. But the nation is Murica. Apostrophe M-U-R-I-C-A. Murica. Right? That's the nation. And Murica is an abstract. Right? There's no institution that claims allegiance to Murica. It's just something we all believe in. And that's kind of what the Treaty of Westphalia did. It says, no. These abstract concepts of nations, they're real. They're real. These lines on a map, they're real lines on a map. We are going to start from the premise that nations exist and that these nations have sovereignty. And therefore, the king's job is to be the steward for the concept, if that makes sense. Okay? And what does the idea of sovereignty that comes out of the Treaty of Westphalia entail? That every country has the right to pass within its own borders its own laws, its own reforms, its own systems of government, systems of taxation, whatever they want. What happens in France? It's the French take care of that. What happens in Spain? The Spanish deal with. What happens in Italy? That's the Italians' job. Well, the Italians don't exist yet, but more on that later in the class. That's what is meant. So let me give you a real example from around this time period. Around this period of time, the Netherlands, which had been part of the large empire of Charles V of Spain and Austria, they break free, largely due to religious and political matters. And what they do is create history's first, really large republic. That's right. We as Americans like to say, oh yeah, USA, baby. No. The Dutch do it first. But The Dutch are surrounded to the south by the French, across the water by the English, and to their east by the German Holy Roman Empire. Neither of which is particularly thrilled by having a republic on their borders. Their own peasants might start getting ideas. You know what they can do about it in a Westphalian system? Nothing. They can pound sand all day. They can get mad all they want. Doesn't matter. Because the Dutch have the right to do in their country whatever they want. That's Westphalian sovereignty. And it's very clear that this rule was written with the Pope in mind. It's just that over the years, it's taken on a mind of its own, right? It's become a lot more than that. Our idea of sovereignty is always shifting and changing over the years. In fact, a lot of the debate currently is whether or not we should still follow this system. But for the time, revolutionary. Revolutionary idea. Okay? Point number 3. When it came to international treaties, all countries are equal. Okay? If you broke an international agreement with a small country versus a big country, the consequences should be the same. Okay? Because your word is your word. So if I'm France, again, let's say I'm France, right? But let's just say that I'm the French, yeah? And I make an agreement with Luxembourg, tiny little country, and I make an agreement with the Spanish. Those two agreements are considered equal, even though the Spanish are a lot more powerful than the Luxembourgers. It doesn't matter, because when it came to international agreements, these two countries are the same, essentially. When they're the worth of the treaty, the agreement made is comparable, essentially. Okay? Fundamentally, however, forgetting all of this, the big takeaway is that the Treaty of Westphalia establishes the state as a point of law, right? It is now the law, essentially, that these states exist, okay? Now, you guys had to read for today excerpts of a book, this one. This is Henry Kissinger's World Order, and I guess cards on the table. Please do not take that as an endorsement of Kissinger's politics. Kissinger was a very good historian and a very bad person. And that's sort of the thin line that I'm treading. And so that's sort of, I would like us to look at this work purely as a work of historiography, rather than anything more than that. But Kissinger writes about this figure, Cardinal Richelieu. And Richelieu is important because Richelieu is the guy who actually wrote the Treaty of Westphalia. And so he's talking about Richelieu inventing the idea that the state is both A, abstract, and B, permanent. An abstract and permanent entity existing in its own right. France, abstract concept first and foremost, and there will always be a France. It's an abstract and permanent concept. What are the requirements of France's existence? Not the ruler's personality, or their family interests, or the universal demands of religion. Its lodestar was the national interest. The national interest. I think that's very important. Because listen, let's do a bit of meta history here. Think about the kind of historical figures that exist during this period of time. Right? Maybe you've heard of Henry VIII of England, right? The guy who in the interest of religion and candidly his own horniness, married 6 wives in hopes of an heir and got none of them. And the result was a series of religious conflict in England that culminated with the events that we're going to look at today. The thing is, that's not good for England. Right? Setting aside what was good for Henry VIII, but what was good for Henry VIII doesn't matter. Was that good for England? Probably not. Probably not. Right? And then remember what happens with his daughters. I think I talked about this in lecture 2 too. When Henry VIII dies and his daughter Mary, Catholic, becomes the new ruler, suddenly everyone's got to convert to Catholicism. Then Elizabeth, famous Shakespeare queen, takes control. She's a Protestant. Everyone's got to convert to Protestantism. Then James I, Scottish Catholic. Everyone's got to convert to Catholicism. That's insanity. That's insanity. And one of the things that the Treaty of Westphalia was trying to address is exactly this main point, that it was not in the interests of England to do this. It was rather in the interest of Henry VIII and his progeny to do this. And so ultimately, England lost out because this wasn't in the national interest. Okay? The priority of a state is literally its own survival, not its individual rulers and what they want. Hell, not even the survival of its individual rulers. But let's sort of take a step back. Broader concept. If in this new world that's being created post 1648, if the king is no longer a requirement for the existence of the state, but the king is more or less just chief bureaucrat, essentially, and the king does the interests of the state, allegedly, what happens when they don't in this new world? Well, just 1 year later, in 1649, we saw exactly what happens. This is King Charles I of England being very publicly beheaded. Found guilty in a court of law, his own government, and beheaded by the government. Think about that. That would never happen in a feudal country. In a feudal society, my government beheading me, just that's a non-starter. That doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? Right? The government, I created the government. But now the situation is different. And what is about to happen is incredibly fascinating. Because what we're going to look at is one of the first works that is created during this period of time by someone who witnesses or lives through these events of what happens in the aftermath of the execution of Charles I, a series of events that we refer to as the English Civil War. Parliamentarians versus royalists in the struggle for power between Parliament and the monarch. And as this war is being fought, as this war is being combated, there's a young man out in the countryside in England that's studying to be a doctor. Now, this might seem unrelated, but I promise it's relevant. And as all of this starts to happen, the government, trying to combat essentially a civil war, retrenches, sort of goes back like turtles into its shell. But in a mercantilist system where the government is literally providing essential services, a lot of the products at the store are government products. So if the government isn't there, suddenly now what? And it starts out small. This young man witnesses something happen in his town. Two neighbors get into a fight over something stupid. The things that neighbors always get into a fight over. Oh, your fence is a little too far this way. Oh. Well, in this case, one of the neighbors goes into his shed, gets a pitchfork, stabs the other, and leaves. Leaves the body in the street, goes home. But because the government is otherwise preoccupied, no one comes to arrest the murderer. In fact, I'll take it a step further. No one comes to pick up the body. Just stays there. As the government begins to disappear, this young man observes the world suddenly start to kind of disintegrate around him. Essential services start to disappear. Bandits inhabit the forests of England. Pirates start to sail around the coastline. This young man decides then on the spot, hey, I guess politics is important. I should write a book about that. This was Thomas Hobbes. Trying to understand what he was witnessing as the government in England was slowly starting to collapse during the English Civil War. So, what does he do? Well, man's a doctor. He applies doctor brain to it. He says, if you want to understand a problem, you got to break it down into its constituent parts. You want to understand a disease, you got to break it down to its symptoms. You want to understand anything, you got to break it down into its symptoms. So what is the most, if you want to understand the nature of politics, you have to break down politics into its constituent parts. So what are the constituent parts of politics? At its core level, what's politics about? Maybe some of you just said power. Maybe other of you maybe just said money. Those are good answers. But for Hobbes, it's more basic than that. It's the constituent part of politics is people. It's about us. Power is only matters because it helps us, control other people. Money helps us persuade or, coerce other people. Money on its own is useless. Money is only useful because it helps us get things from other people. People is the most important part of politics. So if you want to understand politics, you got to understand people. Okay, cool. How do we do that? Well, in the first part, Hobbes of the book, the part that you don't read, and nobody ever really reads, but I want to include this. Hobbes includes how people work literally. I mean that, literally. Right? He spends the whole first third of the book or so talking about and here's how our eyes work, and here's how our ears work. And it's all wrong, right? All of it. It's completely wrong. But I find it fascinating because he's approaching it from, I called it doctor brain, but that's kind of how this is, right? He's approaching this from the angle of I want to understand how people work mechanically, right? How do their brains work? How does all this stuff work? And so what he says is, what if we he says the problem is a lot of our behavior is socially constrained. It's not a natural indication of who we are as people. What do I mean by that? Let me explain. So I'm doing this lecture live for students at Montclair. If you come by after, hello. But this is a live lecture for my Montclair kids. So my Montclair kids will get this. When our class lets out and you go get to your car and you try to leave out a Yogi Berra Drive, and it's chaos, right? Because everyone's trying to leave at once, and there's 3 lights all in a row. There's the one on Clove Road, there's the one on Normal Avenue, and there's the one on Yogi Berra. All right? And it's anarchy. It's chaos. Okay? But fundamentally, what we don't do is open up our trunks and pull out a baseball bat and start to, fight our way through, right? We understand that, hey, that's a red light. I have to stop. And there's a lot of things about our behavior that is what we would call socially learned. We weren't born with this knowledge, but we learned it by, insert your Joker memes here, living in a society. Here's a stupid example that I always like to think of when I bring this up. In school, in classes at college level, you always sit in the same spots, and I've never understood this because you guys have spent your entire high school careers begging your teachers to be able to sit anywhere you want on any given day, and now that you have the ability to do that, none of you do it. You pick a spot and you sit there every single time because that is an understood social norm and social understanding of here's how this stuff works. And what else you don't do is you don't sit in the front of the class. Even though the comfortable chair might be there, right? Compared to the raggedy ones that they make you sit at, right? Even though the desk might be bigger, you don't sit there because that's my seat. But I never sit there. My name's not on it. So it could be yours. You don't know. You've never sat there. And I think the larger point that I'm trying to say is that that's socially learned behavior. It's stuff you don't even think about anymore. The problem is that if you understand how people work, you can't consider all that stuff because all that stuff is a reflection of how society works, not about how people work. So if you want to understand people, but genuinely understand people, you have to imagine a world where none of that exists, where all of that is just non-existent. We need to imagine a world free of the constraints of society. Hobbes calls this thought experiment a state of nature. The state of nature, the world of man absent society. And I ask here, is this a utopia? But the reality is, according to Hobbes, this is chaos. This is chaos. This is a chaotic thing. So, what do I mean when I say chaos? Hobbes makes it explicit. Hereby it is manifest that during the time that all men live without a common power, to keep them all in awe, keep them all in check, that condition is called war. And that such a war is of every man against every man. Put simply, in Latin, homo homini lupus. Man is a wolf to man. So for Hobbes, fundamentally, the state of nature and the state of war are the same thing. Cool. Way to be an edgelord there, Tom. But why? Why? Is Hobbes just being an emo 14-year-old in this moment? Right? Listening to a little bit too much of Linkin Park. What's going on here? Why is Hobbes saying this? There is a reason. In order to understand that reason, let's imagine the unthinkable. Montclair State University gives us money to do something. I know that's just a fanciful idea. But let's just imagine. Try with me, if you will. Right? John Lennon is playing in the background. Imagine a future, a better world, in which Montclair gives us money. And we decide to use that money to go on a field trip. And off we fly to Las Vegas, Nevada. And there we're going to watch the latest installment of YouTube Boxing. Right? Although I've heard they don't do that much anymore, but let's just say that they do. YouTube Boxing. In one corner, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And in the other corner, Kevin Hart. So in one corner we have Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. And in the other corner we have Kevin Hart in this very, very, very seemingly uneven boxing match. And because this is Vegas, we can bet on the fight. Who are we putting our money on? Who are we putting our chips on? I can almost guarantee you'd be putting money on Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Because you understand that The Rock, in a straight boxing match, is going to beat Kevin Hart every time. I don't even think Kevin Hart would be offended by that. He'd probably agree with that assessment. But that's because boxing is a sport with rules. But what if there were no rules? What if Kevin Hart could bring a gun? Then it's about 50-50, right? Maybe The Rock, I'd still give an edge to The Rock. But it's closer, right? It's 50-50. What if Kevin Hart could bring his friends? What if it's like a 4-on-1? Then what? Because there are no rules. So Kevin Hart can do what he wants. That's what Hobbes says. Hobbes says, nature hath made men so equal in the faculties of body and mind that though there might be found one man sometimes manifestly stronger in body, or of a quicker mind than another, when all is reckoned, when you put everything together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable. Because the weakest human being has the strength to kill the strongest human being, either by secret machination, by trickery, or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger, or by getting a bunch of people who all agree, hey, this big strong guy needs to go, right? So we're all roughly equal. Maybe not perfectly equal, but we're all in the same ballpark. We're all more or less in the same ballpark. But from that, oh, shoot, I don't know what happened there. There we go. What happened there? Sorry, give me 1 second. Properties, window capture. Sorry. Hit the wrong button on my iPad. That's what happens when I do things blind. There we go. No harm, no foul. So, as I was saying, from this equality of an ability comes an equality of hope in obtaining our goals. Imagine, if you will, two people in the post-apocalypse. All right? Finding the most beautiful thing anyone has ever seen. A spicy Italian sub from Wawa. Right? And we can't split that. Because we never watched Barney the Dinosaur, so we didn't know that sharing is caring. Right? So Hobbes says that if any two men desire the same thing that they nevertheless cannot both enjoy, because they can't share it, they'll become enemies. And in the way to their goal, they will endeavor to destroy one another. And that's it. That's the secret. Because we're all roughly the same, when we find things we want, we're going to fight over them. Because Kevin Hart is not that scared of Dwayne Johnson in The State of Nature. Because there are no rules. There's nothing telling Kevin Hart that he can't just shoot Dwayne Johnson and take his steroids. Oh, I'm sorry. Was I not supposed to say that? I wasn't supposed to say that. Anyway. So, the state of nature is first and foremost a state of war, of everyone against everyone. And, if you're watching this, bold, underline, highlight it in your notes, make the font bigger in your notes. The state of nature is not survival of the fittest. If you include this in your answer, you are getting a 0, because you did not understand this. Because in survival of the fittest does really well. In survival of the fittest, right, where the strongest survive, Highlander rules, the strongest goes, actually, I really like this system. This system really works well for me. I like it here. No. The point of the state of nature is that it sucks for everybody. Nobody wins. Nobody wins. It's just a terrible life for all of us. Because we are competing over scarce resources. We're all roughly similar. And there's no higher authority to say, hey, don't do that. Bad. Now, Hobbes writes, in such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and therefore consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things that require force, no knowledge, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society. Nothing can happen in the state of nature. So, again, everyone's favorite part of the live stream, pop culture references with Mark Lane. I don't know, because you guys are starting to get a little too young for this show, but maybe you guys watched The Walking Dead before it became a really, really bad show. It's people trying to survive in a world infested with zombies. The show is not that deep. But over time, the characters in that show, they stop watching, keeping account of time. Right? You don't know how long has passed. You don't know where they're going. They lose track of everything just by passage of time. You lose all of the things that make human society what it is. And in the most famous line of the book, worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. and the life of man becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and most importantly of all, short. The life of man becomes short for everyone. This is a system that is terrible for everyone. So, you might be thinking to yourself, because I see you behind that keyboard. I'm looking at you, Kyle, right? I don't have a Kyle in this class, but I'm looking at you, Kyle. You might be thinking to yourself, hey, I am, to quote the great philosopher of our time, Nicole Snooki Polizzi, quote, a fucking good person, she said as she was being arrested. But maybe you think like that too. Maybe you think, I am a good person. I'm a good being. I would never do this. That would be wrong. Hobbes has an answer for you. Hobbes says that to this war of every man against every man, this is also true. That nothing can be unjust. Because the notions of right and wrong and justice and injustice have there no place. Your ideas of right and wrong are themselves social constructs. You know how I know this? Because we disagree on what right and wrong is. There is no objective right and wrong, because otherwise we wouldn't have a disagreement on it, right? Thanksgiving would be a lot less fun, wouldn't it? Right? When you get your random uncle who got too far into QAnon, right? We disagree. We disagree on right and wrong. We do. Because these things are not objectively true. These are social constructs that we have created. Where there is no common power, there is no common law. There is no law. And where there's no law, how can there be injustice? That's just not a thing. So, question. We don't live in this system anymore. We've left the state of nature. How did we do that? How did we leave the state of nature? The solution I actually already gave you. I actually already gave you the solution to the puzzle of how we leave the state of nature, why we don't live in the system anymore, according to Hobbes. The answer is this. This is the original cover of Hobbes' Leviathan. I should have Hobbes' Leviathan on my shelf somewhere. It might be in the other shelf. Anyway, do I have it here? I don't have it here. This is the cover. When you go buy Leviathan in the store, if you want to read the whole thing, don't. But if you do, you'll find this cover. Okay? This is essentially what Hobbes envisions the king, the ideal sovereign of a nation, to be like. And if you pay attention, the body of this monarch is made from people. The answer is people. The solution to the problem was people. Essentially, in Hobbes' state of nature, we get together and we make an agreement. We make a compact with each other, a social contract with one another. And what do we do in this social contract? We agree to give up some of our freedoms. We call this loss of freedom the law, right? Hey, don't kill people is a pretty bog standard law pretty much everywhere you go, right? But you could think of that as I'm giving up the freedom to murder whoever I want. It's just a loss of freedom that we're cool with, I hope. Okay? And so in exchange, we give up some of our freedoms to empower someone amongst us, as part of this social contract. And this social contract, this sort of sovereign that we've elevated as part of the social contract, has one job: our safety. That's it. That's the only job. Anything else is cookies. It's a bonus. We get that for being nice. But that's not the core role of government, according to Hobbes. The core role of government is safety. Because think about it. Otherwise, if the government can't keep us safe, well then what's the point? I want my freedoms back. If I'm going to be unsafe, I'd rather be unsafe with all the freedoms I gave up than unsafe with them. Right? I'd rather go back to the state of nature. No, the job of the sovereign is safety. In a word, national security. Okay? Let me give you an example. A stupid example, but an example. So, and assuming many of you watching work, all right, you do something, all right, you get some extra money. Let's say, now one day, you decide to take your money and you decide to write a letter. Old school. You pull out your pen and paper, you lick the pen. You're going to write this piece of fan mail to El Chapo Guzman, the notorious Mexican drug lord. So, dear Mr. Chapo, first name L, last name Chapo, I'm a big fan of the drugs! Exclamation point. Keep up the good work. Enclosed is $500 for you to continue your efforts. Signed, your name, XOXO. You put it up in the letter and you send it off. And about a week later, someone shows up at your door. Will it be El Chapo? No. It will be the FBI. And you are going to jail for sending money to El Chapo. But what about your free speech? I thought this was America. I thought you had the right, to express yourself with your donations however you wanted. I thought this was a free country, right? Turns out, there are limits. Turns out, national security is perhaps the biggest one of those limits. National security, your government's obligation to keep you safe, will always trump your rights, because those are bonuses. Those you get for being nice, right? Those you get because the government likes you. But that's not the government's core obligation. The government's core obligation is safety. Now, two things. Number one, the idea of the social contract is an enduring one. In fact, it has stuck around. If you or any of your friends or family have ever been naturalized and become American citizens, well, then you will know that the social contract is actually a really real contract. When you pass your citizenship test, you sign a social contract. It's a real thing in which you agree to the rights and responsibilities of being an American citizen. But the second point is interesting. Because at the time, listen, for 2024, the things that Hobbes wrote they're probably considered a little regressive. Yeah, you're probably like, okay, I see his point, but I wouldn't want a government that's ruled on Hobbesian ideas. But for the time, that's huge. Because if I'm the king, Hobbes is saying that my power does not come from the man upstairs. I am not king because God says so. I'm king because you say so. You have empowered me to be your king. Right? You can very clearly see how this evolves out of the Treaty of Westphalia, right? How this sort of becomes the political ideological basis. This and Westphalia go like this, if it wasn't obvious. But there's a hidden point. A part of this that we need to kind of talk about. Because yes, it's true that English Mark, what are you trying to say? It is true that I'm king because you say so, and I have these obligations. But if I'm not meeting those obligations, if I'm not keeping you safe for whatever reason, you have the right to alter the agreement, to tear up the social contract. Or, in a word, this. You have the right to replace me if I'm not doing my job. And that's huge. Hobbes' writings become incredibly influential for the period of time, and they help us understand this moment in history in which the culture around government is changing. But listen, you need to understand this, because this class will allow everything that's going to happen to happen. Here is my hot take of the class. If the Treaty of Westphalia had never happened, there is no revolution in the United States. There's no French Revolution. There's no Haitian Revolution. There's just no revolutions. Because implied in the Treaty of Westphalia is the ability to have different forms of government without foreign intervention. The ability to remove kings that are not doing their job, that are incompetent, and that there are certain expectations of monarchy. There's a great little TV show that my wife just started on Netflix. You've probably heard of it, The Crown. Maybe your parents watch this. This is a show about Queen Elizabeth II. Queen Elizabeth II. In her life, being caught between wanting to be a person and having to be a monarch. And that she couldn't be both. Oftentimes she had to choose between being a monarch and being a human being. And oftentimes the monarch won that debate. Being a monarch matters a lot more than being a person. Now I know you might be thinking, oh, boo-hoo, please feel bad for the rich right lady that literally invented imperialism. I hear you. But I find it fascinating as a reflection of this moment and this transition. So, I do not see any chats, so I'm assuming there are no questions about the midterm, but just a couple things on the midterm and how it will work. The midterm will have 3 sections, either 2 or 3. I'm still kind of working on it. For sure, it'll have a multiple choice section and a concept ID section. The concept ID section is just going to be, I'm going to give you a phrase, I'm going to give you a concept, I'm going to give you a something, and you have to identify it for me. You have to tell me what it is. Okay? Think about it like reverse dictionary almost, yeah? Then you will have, maybe, I'm still undecided yet whether or not I'm going to do a short essay question. This is all going to be completed on Blue Books. All right? So I'm going to be bringing Blue Books to class. You will do your exam on those Blue Books. When you're done, you get to keep the exam sheet. The sheet with the questions, that's yours to keep. That is your study guide for this unit. So that when you're working on the final and you think, I wonder what Mark really wanted me to remember from Unit 1. If it's on the midterm, chances are I wanted you to remember it. Okay? So a really good way to study going forward would be to just go through that midterm and say, okay, Mark needed me to remember this, and this. So you get to keep the exam. I only want the Blue Book back from you with all your answers in it, which means for the multiple choice section, you got to put those in the Blue Book, because if they're not there, can't grade them. You'd be surprised how many students have gotten that wrong over the years. Each multiple choice section question will be worth 1 point. Each concept ID will be worth 2 points. Okay? Other than that, one final thing. And this is because I am feeling so nice and so generous. And I just, again, I am the aforementioned, quote, fucking good person. I will give you a cheat sheet. You will get to bring 1 sheet of handwritten notes to the exam. I will check. They have to be handwritten. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, why can't I just do typed up? Why is it handwritten? 2 reasons. Number 1, because a lot of y'all write my slides word for word, and so you're just going to take your notes and make them, a series of notes for ants and just print it out and be done. No. You have to write them down. You have to take the time and effort to write down the notes and write down what you think in 1 sheet of normal printer paper, front and back. You can do front and back, but that's it. That's all you get. So when you come to class on Friday, what you're going to do is you're going to come up, you're going to show me your exam. Here it is. Okay, your exam, your cheat sheet. You're going to show me. Everything works. Everything checks out. You can have a seat. Okay? Other than that, pretty straightforward. Listen, I'm giving you all the tools to succeed. I held this lecture live so you guys could come in and ask me questions. I'm going to make myself available via email if and how I can. But if there are no other questions, I think I'll leave it there. So guys, have a very wonderful night, and I will see you all on Friday. Okay? Cool? All right, guys. Bye.